Chapter 130, A Sow's Blood, A Sow's POV. And when I stepped down, the rock moved. It was a fish. A sow sat in his chair, no, Lord Julia's chair, listening to Lord Thaddeus's story of a long-ago underwater expedition and feeling very nearly content. His face, feet, and thighs ached a little. Lord Julia had been reducing his dosage of pain medicine, which left his body sore but his mind clearer. That made it easier to follow the strand of Lord Thaddeus's story. Of course, that wasn't so strange all on its own, the god said. There are plenty of them who hunt that way, blending into the sand or looking like rocks and then popping out to catch their prey. I've disturbed plenty of them before, and I will again. A sow wished he could join the god on those aquatic journeys, needing no air and content to walk the ocean floor with only a rope tethering him to the world above. It sounded like the most perfect, total solitude that could possibly exist, and it would even be peppered with strange discoveries, like the one the god was describing at the moment. But this one was different. It had a shock, like a lightning eel. The shock was much weaker than that of a lightning eel, of course, but at the time I'd never experienced such a thing from a saltwater fish before. Lord Thaddeus's cheerful voice cut off suddenly, and a sow peered anxiously at the god, trying to force his gaze to focus on Lord Thaddeus's expression. It was a frustrating and largely futile exercise. His one eye still took in movement and colors, but focusing and gauging distance remained a struggle, and he couldn't read the god's expression well enough to tell what it had caused him to stop talking. What did I do wrong? The sow probably hadn't looked interested enough. That was the problem with getting caught up in Lord Thaddeus's stories. He got so interested that he forgot to perform his interest. That was inexcusable. A god was choosing to spend his time entertaining an ailing, ugly, half-blind slave, and a sow had to show his appreciation for that kindness every moment. He was just opening his mouth to beg Lord Thaddeus's forgiveness when the door opened. Ah! The god must have heard the footsteps in the hallway. Lord Julia must be back. Relieved, a sow bent over his lap in a clumsy imitation of a bow. Inadequate as it was the only homage Lord Julia would permit until he was feeling better. That was frustrating. During his time with Lord Marcus, a sow had done more while feeling much worse than this, and he'd survived just fine. In fact, he was astonished by how rapidly his body seemed to be recovering. Lord Julia's healing powers were truly those of a deity's. Now, however, the healer god wasn't alone. Was that even her? A sow was used to her light, confident steps, and now there was a sound of heavy stumbling at the door. He chanced to peek, and his altered eyesight made out a tangle of limbs, the clothes that Lord Julia had been wearing earlier, and also an unmistakable flash of silver, a long braid. Lord Antony! My lords, a sow stammered. He cursed his fumbling tongue. This was not the time to stammer. He had to be better. He was in his master's presence again, the master who had saved his unworthy life and been injured in the process. What could he be doing here? Was he planning to examine his damaged property, to decide whether a sow was worth keeping? The thought aroused a wild storm of feelings that a sow could only categorize as treacherous. Lord Antony had done so much for him and been so unfathomably kind, and it was treacherous for a sow to want to belong to Lord Thaddeus after all that mercy. On the other hand, Lord Thaddeus and Lord Julia had tended to him as if he were a fellow god, remaining by his side and talking with him and showering him in undeserved compliments and endless consideration, and it was treacherous for a sow to betray that goodness by longing for Lord Antony to find him worthy and take him back. He wanted both outcomes. What was wrong with him? At least this meeting would allow him to thank Lord Antony as he should have done before. Surely Lord Julia would let him kneel for that? Oh, hello, everyone, Lord Thaddeus said brightly. Antony, Hanyu, it's good to— A sow! Antony tensed at Hanyu's voice, then tensed even more when his friend's feet clattered loudly over the floor as he came to stand by Esau's chair. He'd spoken without permission, moved without permission, ignored Lord Thaddeus's greeting, and most importantly, interrupted a god. He waited for the explosion, for punishments and recriminations. He prepared to intervene and beg mercy for his reckless friend. But even as Esau's body tensed and his mind whirred in readiness for all of this, he realized that it was all simply habit. He didn't actually expect Lord Thaddeus or Lord Julia to be angry. He didn't even expect Lord Antony to be angry, not with his beloved Hanyu. Careful, he cautioned himself. It wouldn't do to start trusting too much to the gods' mercies, even gods who had been so unnaturally gentle as these. That could lead to laxness and mistakes. But then, Hanyu could get away with these behaviors. He was the treasured prized belonging of the lord of the ship, the apple of their master's eye. Esau, on the other hand, was maimed and disfigured. Even if Lord Antony kept him or Lord Thaddeus took him in, he had no illusions about his value. He would be treading on thin, splintering boards every day, and he swore to be watchful how he stepped so that they would never crack beneath his feet. He couldn't afford to do otherwise. Hanyu was still speaking. "You look... gods! You look good!" Esau barely managed to restrain a scoff. He was healing well, yes, but good was a stretch. Good would be a stretch for the rest of his life. The last few days, he'd felt as though he'd been making his peace with that. Lord Thaddeus and Lord Julia truly didn't seem repulsed by him. On the rare occasions when Lord Cloelia came into the infirmary instead of standing guard and running errands outside, she greeted him without a trace of disgust or pity in her booming, headache-inducing voice. After a few days of that acceptance, Esau had begun to feel as though perhaps the scars and eye patch weren't so bad. After all, he could still serve in some ways. When he was healed, he would be able to clean and fetch and, most importantly, offer his blood. He didn't strictly need to be beautiful to be fed from, though of course any failure to be pleasing would still be a terrible failing on his part. Perhaps he could wear a veil so he wouldn't offend the god's eyes as he performed his duties. Perhaps Lord Antony would excuse his inadequacies if it meant he didn't have to drain his precious Hanyu so often. Perhaps Lord Thaddeus would continue to be unbothered by Esau's altered appearance. Perhaps it could still be all right. Under the eyes of his master and his old friend, all that tentative acceptance of his situation dispersed like a puff of dust. He bowed his head deeper, as if that could somehow hide the ruin of his face. "Julia!" Lord Antony's voice was sharp, and Esau flinched at the sound. "What's going on?" "He's angry." Of course he was angry, finding his useless, broken attendant being coddled like this. Esau had known it was wrong, that he was being bad and lazy, but Lord Julia had insisted. That didn't matter, of course. It was just an excuse, and Esau knew better than to give excuses. He displeased his master. That was all that mattered. He opened his mouth to request his punishment, then closed it just in time when he remembered that that wasn't allowed. Lord Julia's familiar steps broke him from his unhappy thoughts. She started moving down the length of the room, then back up. Pacing? Why? Listen, I didn't tell Theo or Felix or Cloelia either, all right? The god said, her voice tense and nervous and a little small, the way it got when she asked Esau about anything to do with his lost eye. You're all the first to know. I never meant to leave you in the dark, especially not you, Esau. I just wasn't sure how to... Oh, gods! Esau cowered in his seat. He didn't know what she might say next, but he knew it would be bad, and it would be all his fault because he was wrong, lazy, bad, ugly, trouble, empty, worthless, bad. When she spoke again, Lord Julia's voice was stronger, almost stern. Esau, you had lost too much blood. Marcus had nicked a vein in your thigh when he was decorating you. She spat the word in disgust, and Esau flinched lower. She'd never let him look at what his former master had carved into his thighs, but he knew from the angry set of her jaws she tended and bandaged the wounds that they were very, very displeasing. "You'd been steadily losing blood from that injury for almost an hour," Lord Julia went on. "It was too much. I was going to lose you." Her voice broke, and Esau couldn't understand where all this emotion was coming from. Hanyu let out a wail and grabbed Esau's hand, but he couldn't even bring himself to glance in his friend's direction. All his attention was focused on Lord Julia, on trying to understand what she was saying and why she sounded so wrecked as she said it. "If I had had any other choices, I wouldn't have risked it, but there were no other options. I conducted a transfusion. I gave you some of my blood. It was dangerous, but I didn't have any choice. You would have died, Esau." "Oh, Julia," Lord Thaddeus murmured, his soft voice echoing Esau's own astonishment. "Oh." Somehow, he hadn't put that together until she said it so baldly. "Died. I could have died." He'd expected to die that night, from the moment his old master showed up on Lord Antony's doorstep. He'd certainly never expected to survive the aftermath of stabbing Lord Marcus. "I didn't just survive out of luck, or even purely due to Lord Antony's mercy. Lord Julia chose that I should live, and she made it so. She gave me her own blood." There was a dizzying thought. The blood of a god rushing around in his veins. Surely that had to mean something. "Two gods have made a gift of my life. I mustn't squander it. No more wallowing over my lost beauty. I need to serve with my whole heart in every way I still can." Hanyu was babbling away next to him, still clutching Esau's hand. His hot, sweaty palm felt strange after all those days of the god's icy touches. When he paused for breath, Esau leaped at the chance to speak, even though he had no idea what he ought to say. My lord, your servant is not worthy of such generosity," he fumbled. "This honor—" "Sana," Lord Antony said, and Esau quieted at once at the sound of his master's voice, confused. Who was Sana? Had Lord Antony forgotten Esau's name, or was this a new name he'd chosen to bestow on either Esau or Hanyu? Gods did that sometimes, he knew. The priest had prepared them for the possibility, occasionally switching all the offerings' names for a week so they could get used to adapting quickly. Esau remembered filing up to the bowl of papers, Father Shu fishing one out and bestowing his new name on him. He and Hanyu had always hoped to get one another's names, but it had never happened. Esau had been Kenta once, though, and Taiki. It never lasted too long, just long enough to make the boys understood that it could be done. Their names didn't belong to them any more than did their clothes, their books, or their bodies. There was no point feeling a sense of ownership over any of them. If his master wished for Esau to be Sana, then he would simply have to steel himself and let go of his old name with no external show of regret, however wrenching the idea might feel. "Not just Sana," Lord Julia replied, confusing Esau more than ever. "Of course you're not the only one who's tried, Antony. You know that." What in the world are they talking about? Esau kept his curiosity safely within his own head. Hanyu, of course, did not. "What do you mean?" he blurted, his tone inexcusably loud and demanding. Esau tried to make his voice especially soft, as though he could somehow cancel out his friend's brashness. "Hanyu, please, our lords don't owe us any—" "Of course I owe you an explanation," Lord Julia interrupted. She strode across the infirmary, and then, horrifyingly, she knelt at Esau's feet. It was so viscerally wrong that Esau longed to fling himself down, abase himself on the floor, and prove that he knew his place, but her strong, cold hand closed around his and anchored him to his seat. He kept his one eye respectfully downcast, but he could still feel the intensity with which the god's own gaze searched his face. "Oh," Lord Thaddeus said softly, and Esau didn't understand the solemn note in his voice, but it scared him. Lord Julia, blessedly, continued her explanation. "Esau, when your blood is contaminated by ours, it becomes addictive. Any one of us who begins drinking it won't be able to stop. I'm afraid no one will be able to feed from you anymore." Fuck! It was going to be even longer before he was functional again. Would Lord Antony be willing to wait? Would Lord Thaddeus? Yes, my lord. Esau dared to glance over at where his master sat, his stupid, altered vision making the god seem flat and remote, as far away as if he'd already thrown Esau out. If your servant may ask, for how long? Lord Julia shook her head and squeezed his hand tighter. I'm sorry, Esau, she said, sounding heartbreakingly humble and frightened. Forever. Forever. The gods can't drink from me. Not ever again. I'm not a pretty decoration. I'm not a desirable fuck toy. I'm not even edible. I thought I was pointless before. What does that make me now? Yes, my lord. His trembling lips formed the words, and he could only pray that the gods didn't hear the edge of hysteria in his tone. I can still do chores, but the gods all have their own attendants for that. Beautiful attendants who they can also use for their pleasure and feed from. What would a god even use me for now? A twinge of pain from his thighs pierced his mind, and Esau realized with a sickening lurch exactly what his only remaining use must be. The stifling press of Hanu's hand vanished. Esau's eye followed the movement dazedly as his friend rushed over to their master and fell at his feet. Please let him stay, my lord, Hanu begged, and even in his despair, Esau could still feel the hot bite of shame. Please, we'll be so good, and I'll feed you every day, and... Don't be stupid, Lord Antony snapped, and Esau flinched at the tension in his tone. Of course I'm keeping him. I'm keeping you, Esau. This doesn't change anything. You'll always have a place in our rooms. Yes, Esau realized dully. That makes sense. Hanu makes our lord angry, but he doesn't want to take it out on his beloved first slave. Lord Antony rejected me before when I offered myself for pain, but now he sees. It's the only use I have left. I'm already ruined. He doesn't have to hold back anymore. Once again, Esau needed to let go of the idea of belonging to Lord Thaddeus. It hurt worse every time he had to relinquish that particular dream. But this time, it was final. Lord Thaddeus was gentle. His voice was soft, his hands were careful, and he never lost his temper. No matter what the story said, he was the least violent-seeming person Esau could imagine. Perhaps it was foolhardy to assume that a blood god with a gruesome reputation had no ruthless side, but if it was there, Esau had never seen it. What use would a god like that have for a whipping boy? Lord Antony and Hanu were still talking, but Esau found that he couldn't focus on their words. Instead, he focused back on Lord Julia, and in his misery, he forgot himself and met her gaze. The god was weeping. Esau was a little startled. At another time, he would have been thunderstruck. He'd never seen the powerful, confident healer crying before, and until now, he wouldn't have even been able to imagine the sight. Now, though, the tears poured freely down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. If I were half the healer I used to be, I could have... I'm so sorry, Esau. We've all hurt you so badly. I never wanted to be one of the people who caused you pain. Why did you do it? It felt as though he had no control over the words, as though he were watching someone else speaking. Why bother saving me at all? Oh dear! When had Lord Thaddeus come to crouch with them? Esau felt the breeze of his frantic hand flapping. Esau, it's not so bad! How can you say that? Esau was afraid he would shriek the words, howl them like a wounded jackal, but his voice stayed soft and precise. I can't serve with pleasure or substance. I should be dead. It would be better if I were dead. Lord Julia moaned. Hanyu gasped in shock. Esau! Lord Antony said nothing at all. A small, chilly hand gripped his shoulder, but let go as soon as Esau flinched away from the touch. Still, when he spoke, Lord Thaddeus's voice was steely. You don't owe us any kind of service, the usually mild-mannered god said, almost sternly. You certainly don't owe us your blood. You've given us enough, more than anyone could ask. It's never enough. I'm a slave, an offering. All my life I've been in debt simply for existing, and I've worked and obeyed and submitted in every way I knew how to try to repay it, but it was never enough. I'm full of bad thoughts and feelings and urges. I didn't want my old master to hurt me, even though it was his right, and when I stabbed him, I liked it. I'm an unnatural attendant, and feeding was the only thing I knew I could do right, no matter what filthy thoughts and feelings I was hiding. I'm bad. I'm only fit to be whip meat, and everyone finally knows. Esau wasn't sure when he'd started laughing. The sound was high and broken, edges sharp enough to feel as if they were slicing the inside of his throat as he released them. And since he didn't know how it had begun, he had no idea how to stop. The tears rained down his face, and he laughed and laughed and laughed.